Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And remember, we're on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok. And don't forget, if you're watching on YouTube, to hit that subscribe button. And joining me today is author John Maxwell. Welcome, John.
Hello, Darren.
Okay, so as it's your first time, John, on the American Civil War and UK history, we'll get into the topic in a minute. So the topic is Liverpool during the American Civil War. But could you please tell us a little bit about how you got into history and how you got into writing books?
Well, a frequently asked question I get with this particular project, which we'll talk about in a bit, Water Street, which connects to Liverpool and the American Civil War, is when did they start writing it? And the answer to that is probably about 160 years ago. Which doesn't mean that I'm 160 years old or I'm a vampire or something like that. It actually it scans back to my own family history, which is really what underpins my interest in the history of Liverpool, but not just the history of Liverpool. Because if you go back far enough with this city, the history of Liverpool is intrinsically linked with the history of the United States and actually the history of the world, because it was a key place in terms of trade. So my sense of place, my sense of where I come from, and my family history has sort of led me to this point, really. My storytelling history comes from being a filmmaker and a writer. I teach digital writing at Liverpool John Maxwell University, so I have that link as well, an academic link with it. But the historical side and the historical fiction side is very deeply rooted.
So, okay then, JP, please tell us a brief history of Liverpool, please.
Right. Well, Liverpool, it's really strange because I live in a suburb of Liverpool called West Derby, which goes all the way back to Viking times. And if you look at a lot of the place names around here, they end in B and Teth and places like that, and names like that, because they're sort of Viking names. So Vikings settled around here going back well over 1,000 years ago. And that's the kind of origin of many of the settlements, including the Wirral Peninsula and so forth. But Liverpool itself was a hamlet. It was kind of non-existent, really. Chester was the main port going back to Roman times. What changed was the growth of trade, really. We received the charter in 1207 from King John, which pretty much recognised Liverpool as a port. So it was the first action by the government or by the administration or royalty at the time, to confirm that Liverpool had a port status, but it was tiny. It was virtually non-existent. What actually changed was Chester. The River Dee silted up, and there were tithes and issues with tax as well, which meant that the port gradually moved over to Liverpool. There were a collection of sort of smaller ports in and around North Wales and the Wirral and Lancashire. But Liverpool started to rise in prominence. So we'll flash forward 1700s, early 1700s, 1720 or so. You've got the first dock in the modern sense was built here, and it was hewn from sandstone in a quarry very close to us, very close to the dock itself. Moved down the hill, and they built this dock. So that was the start of it, really. It was the start of modern commerce, modern trade in many ways, because as that dock sort of developed and then more docks came along, you didn't have the communication network in any kind. The telegraph hadn't really kicked in until the late 19th century. So with the docks came all the ancillary sort of businesses, shipping, trade, banking, and even exchanges for all these goods. Because it made sense to put them right next to where the docks were, where the goods were coming in. So that grew, and the city itself grew because you needed to accommodate all these people who were coming to town. So one thing was built on another. Liverpool grew exceptionally quickly in the 19th century. So it was unlike London or any of the other British cities in that sense. I think Bristol's probably the closest, and maybe Glasgow as well, were the closest in terms of how they just burgeoned in this period. But Liverpool came from pretty much nothing at this time. 1600s maybe started to grow a little bit. 1700s, the Georgian era, it started to grow from that first dock, and then the 19th century boom. It just absolutely exploded to the extent that the population was much bigger in the mid 19th century than it is now.
Okay, thank you. So, John, please tell us about the importance of Liverpool during the 1860s, please.
Well, during the 1860s, Liverpool was in the middle of probably its biggest growth period in terms of population, and so many things scan to population. If you look at the figures, it went from being a relatively small town, still an important port in the early 19th century. In the mid 19th century, there were several world events or kind of changes that influenced Liverpool becoming a very influential place. One was the growth in trade. So you had the Industrial Revolution really at full tilt. You had shipbuilding technology, warehousing technology, and Liverpool's strategic place as an Atlantic port really coming into prominence. So it was in high demand. You had a bigger and bigger flow of goods coming back and forth. The northwest of England in particular, the north of England in general, but the northwest in particular, with the mill towns, the proximity of Lancashire and Manchester and Leeds to Liverpool by canal and rail and road, really ramped this up as well, because you had a huge manufacturing base within a very short distance of the port. So the raw materials would come as the port, and you could link this essentially really to the slave industries in many ways. So you've got tobacco, molasses or sugar, you've got rum, you've got king cotton, as we call it. And we call it king cotton because out of all these products, cotton was the real driver. It's what brought the wealth into the city. Now, on the other hand, you had something else going on, which was less connected with wealth and more with desperation. So you had, in the 1840s, what I like to term the Great Hunger. Some people call it the potato famine, but I don't think that's an accurate term in modern parlance, simply because it wasn't just about a potato blight, it was about policy. And I'll talk about some of the actors involved with that later on. So Liverpool's population shot up. You had a lot of desperately, mainly Irish people coming into the city from the 1840s onwards. And obviously, as Civil War aficionados will know, this overlaps with the period of the Civil War, so going from 1861 to 1865, and the influence that we had in this city at the time. And it was such that the American or the United States government deemed it important for us to have a consulate here. And this was going all the way back to 1790, so the importance was starting to grow back then. But by the time of the Civil War, this is some 70 years afterwards, the consulate was a very important spot, and for very specific reasons to do with not just economic reasons, but military reasons.
Okay, this is an important one next, this question. So Liverpool for the Confederacy or for the Union? Now, before you answer, I just want to say something that I've always learned, and I've learned over time, that there's a lot of things out there that say that the higher class people were for the Confederacy and the lower class people were for the Union. But so where does Liverpool stand when it comes to who they would support in the war that's going on over in America?
It's very, and I think you'll probably be familiar with this, Darren, with, looking at the American Civil War per se. The fact is it happened in the mid 19th century, and looking at it through a modern prism is fraught with difficulties. One of those difficulties is presuming that everyone's got an opinion. Now, there were certain groups within Liverpool who maybe moderated, and it's sort of covered in my book a little bit, maybe moderated this kind of view that Liverpool was for the Confederacy. Certainly, many of the powerful areas of Liverpool, i.e. the cotton exchange, so like nouveau riche cotton traders, and the city administration, the mayor, the shipbuilders to a certain degree, had a vested interest in the Confederacy. But let's not forget how long the Confederacy was around for in its form, in its working form. For the duration of the Confederacy, it was around in Liverpool for the same period of time. So, we're talking 5-6 years. It kind of appeared. So it was a very new thing. And in a sense, there wasn't that much of a distinction in the average sort of mind between the Confederacy and the Union. It was just seen as American, and the subtleties and of what was going on actually stateside, and the vicious war that kind of ensued over there. The news wasn't traveling back readily to the average Joe or Josephine. It was so it's mitigated by that. I think I also wanted to talk about, though, some of the actors and some of the characters in this, because there are three distinct, actually American characters who came to Liverpool, who were involved in this struggle, really, for hearts and minds in the city. So, we take Manchester, for instance, and you mentioned Manchester before. Manchester was an interesting place because Manchester was already developing quite strong sort of pressure groups and moral consciousness, probably linked back to the likes of the Peterloo and events like that. And then flashing forward, you got the suffragette movement later on in the century. So Manchester did have a sort of quite a moral sort of crusade attached to it, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit, because there's a notable rivalry between Liverpool and Manchester. But Liverpool, in a broader sense, in terms of the power in the city, was probably in the wrong side of history as far as it was seen. The support for the Confederacy was really strong, as I say, in the moneyed sort of areas. And there was a distinct reason for that. I'll go into more detail on this later on. The cotton drought. Essentially, as many of your listeners will be aware of, there was a Union blockade. There wasn't, particularly at the beginning of the war, there wasn't that much of a Confederate Navy, certainly in terms of being able to compete and battle with the Union at sea like they were at land. On land, it's well documented that the artillery and the land forces in some cases, and indeed the leadership of the Confederate Army was very, very strong in some ways and threatening. Whereas at sea, it was more a case of privateers and incursions. But generally, the Union blockade was a massive threat. It was a massive threat to industry in the northwest of England and to trade within Liverpool, as it was seen at the time. There'd just been a massive cotton boom in 1859, and then suddenly, 2 years later, it was under threat. So you had this groundswell of support within the sort of newly rich, and if I was to describe the vast fortunes that were made very, very quickly in the mid-19th century, newly rich avenues within Liverpool. So that is a kind of broad way of describing how much power was put behind the Confederate cause in the city. Again, going back to it, three main actors, so American characters. We've got the incumbent consul to the city, because like I said before, the US government saw it as being very important that they had a consulate here. And it existed for 70 years by the time this guy came around. A gentleman called Thomas Haynes Dudley. And he was the official Union consul, the United States government to Liverpool, based on Paradise Street. And this building still stands. There's even a golden eagle above the entrance. And the irony is that you can go and have a nice French steak there these days. But yeah, it is still in existence. Now, Dudley was fighting tooth and nail, really, to pin back the Confederate influence in Liverpool. There's another character called James Dunwoody Bullock. Now, this man was an out-and-out Confederate, believed in the cause, and he was actually the future uncle of President Teddy Roosevelt. So from a very powerful Southern family, seasoned lieutenant in the Union Navy pre-war, and then he was promoted to commander in the Confederacy. Hugely ambitious, he was sent to Liverpool in order to further Richmond's maritime interests. And this is going pretty much, like I said before, from ground zero. They needed ships. They needed to break this Union blockade, and it was a very quick and very powerful sort of movement. It went from virtually nothing. So James Dunwoody Bullock is really the face of this. He's espousing the Confederate cause and pushing the building of ships in the city. And then there's a third character, a gentleman of French extraction called Charles Prelue. Now, Prelue was a cotton merchant. So again, there's a link between the Cotton Exchange and the Confederacy. A massive worry that their vast riches are going to suddenly disappear. And Prelue really preyed on this. He knew how to push the buttons. So he was the kind of financier, really. He was the business brains behind all this. So he came over from Charleston, and he was instrumental in setting up diplomatic and business ties. And ultimately, even between 1861 and 1865, two consulates appeared, one after the other, in Liverpool. Firstly in Runford Place, in connection with his company, which was a kind of shell company to deal with financing these ironclad vessels and a variety of them, which I'll talk about later. Prelue set up two consulates, one in Runford Place, and then later on a bigger one in 1865, towards the end of the war. But there was still a massive groundswell of support even then in the city. Abercrombie Square, both buildings again still stand, and if you go into the Confederate consulate in Abercrombie Square, it really signals how much Richmond wanted this link with Liverpool. And actually, a victorious Confederacy would have seen Liverpool as its hub, its centre of trade. It really put so much value in that, possibly because it was simpler in terms of communicating with the city than it was with Westminster, who were tied to diplomatic links with the North. Mm-hmm. So there's a sort of nutshell of how big the American Civil War, and indeed this kind of are you for the Union or for the Confederacy, was in the city.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I want to reiterate what John said. The fact that we are looking at it from a different period of history, and so you've got to look at it a different way. So I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? There's a lot of, war makes money or prints money, as they say. When there's a war going on, people make money. Of course, the British government are making money as well, aren't they, out of all of this? I mean, at the beginning, we're sending rifles, things like that. But so basically, Liverpool, is involved in the Confederacy side because of their vested interests, like you said, in financial reasons, really, aren't they? That's the point, isn't it?
And again, I suppose you got this kind of modern prism now. What's the current view of Liverpool? Well, the sort of negative stereotypes there, and that's another podcast in itself, and probably not to do with the American Civil War. But if you go back to the time, just to get into people's heads, it's a stat I like to wheel out. Liverpool, if it was of comparative size to what it was then, would be a city of 5 million people. Now that's bigger than Paris. Just to kind of, just to get across, you're talking about
for that time period, yeah,
it's mind blowing. Manchester was every other city apart from London really was. Glasgow again had a fairly comparative influence, but even Glasgow, Liverpool was a really thriving city at the time. you can't really underestimate the kind of the level that it was taken seriously, and the sort of sense of running it from an individual sort of point of view. Even though Britain was categorically at the, you know, at the risk of being joining the war themselves, or being having war declared upon them, Britain was categorically neutral. In actual fact, what was going on was it was very slow moving to stop this trade with the South. John Russell, who was the Foreign Secretary for the predominant period of the war, but he had been Prime Minister during the Irish Hunger. Very interesting character, Lord John Russell. He was slow to act. He was quite happy to let vessels be built in the city, albeit under, and I'll go into more detail when we talk about the whole shipbuilding thing, albeit under certain conditions. But he was also quite happy to let trade flow as much as possible under the radar. This was being legally challenged by the likes of Haynes Dudley, the aforementioned consul to the city, Union consul. So you had this kind of battle in the courtrooms, and you had this battle in the shipyards in many ways, and this battle on the streets really for information, for intel. Really scans it like some sort of like Cold War intrigue, really, that was happening back and forth, because these were important moves that were being made. It was laying the groundwork for that would have an effect thousands of miles away. The southern economy had to keep running in order to be able to prop up the war machine. Like, you would see with anything, the First World War, you flash forward to that ultimately it was won and lost on an economic basis. It was a war of attrition on the front, but it was Germany's economy collapsed. You go even further forward, the Soviet Union collapsed because of economic conditions. So in these sort of circumstances, you need to have that strong economy to be able to prop up a war machine. And what was happening in Liverpool really underpinned all that.
Yeah. And again, people's livelihoods are linked to all of these things, and that's going to be the next topic. Is, of course, you've mentioned the growth of this city to 5 million people, but one of those reasons is because of the Industrial Revolution. Right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and especially in the northwest of England, that is where a lot of the mills and the factories are, isn't it? So tell us about Liverpool during this period.
Well, there was a kind of preoccupation with I suppose any rich place. You could go to the analogy today would maybe be somewhere like Dubai or the UAE or something like that, which comes with its own sort of reputational issues. And Liverpool had reputational issues at the time. In a sense, they did what they wanted to because they had the money, and a certain level of sort of arrogance possibly comes with that, But again, I'm looking at that through a modern prism, Darren. What they could afford to do is buy in the best technology, the best brains to do anything. Now, this goes for everything from Stephenson's rocket, which was the first passenger railway between Manchester and Liverpool. It goes to the canal building that predated that, and then you go forward to the technology in warehousing and docks and indeed banking systems. Very, very sophisticated for its time, and again, I need to sort of reiterate that one of the reasons Liverpool looked the way it did and grew the way it did was because they didn't have communication in the same sense. Even 5-10 years after the American Civil War, this is how fast things were moving. The first telegraphs made a massive difference to the way we communicated. You had to wait for 2 weeks to get news from the United States. So all of this action was going on, behind the curve, and to understand what it was like to exist in the place at the time is to know that certain things moved a lot slower, but in terms of progress, in terms of building, it was exponential. So much of the of the city was kind of was about let's build new, let's have the best there. Crews where they might not have all originally hailed from the city, and I'll talk about the Shenandoah later on as a perfect example of that. But many of them were based here, because they knew that this was where the work was. Again, rich city, specialist labor, specialist crews, they flocked here. So you had this sort of this center of excellence that was going on through the city. Morally, again, dubious. And even at the time, and again, I'm not looking at this through a modern prism, but even at the time, it was being challenged, particularly in Manchester. But who cared? Up to a point, it was a case of like, let's move forward with it, and It was a relentless progress, and kind of unchecked, really, by regulations or by Westminster. Indeed, they saw a thriving city, and why would they want to stop that happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was going to ask that. Was there this jealousy from other big cities in Britain, in particular London, say, for instance, of these, north, up in the northwest, of these cities growing, expanding the way they did, and raking in the money, wasn't they? So was there a little bit of jealousy there, do you think?
Perhaps, but I mean, again, I've depicted this in my book a little bit, and I've sort of made a bit of a joke out of it. But I think London has always been about money itself. Um, and it as a port itself, it understands the mechanisms of trade, and there was more of a basis of comparison between Liverpool and London back then. Now there really isn't a basis of comparison between London and any other city in the UK. But because of the commercial side of it, it was more of a complementary thing that was going on. So that it wasn't really there wasn't really a kind of provincial gap as it was perceived back then. There was a class gap for sure, but that existed within London as it did in Liverpool, as it did in any city.
Yeah.
But this north-south divide, as we see in modern terms, only really probably appeared after the Second World War in many ways. As the kind of heavy industries and the ports declined up here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, back then I think it was more seen as you bring in the money in, great, we want to work with you, want to do business with you.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about one of the biggest trades, and that obviously was the cotton trade. We'll get on to the shipbuilding in a minute. As you mentioned, you've already mentioned this guy, Charles Prelude. So just tell us about the cotton trade and how much wealth were these guys making through this cotton? And again, they're feeding all of these mills. I mean, how many cotton mills were there? There must have been hundreds of them.
There were, but like anything, the more successful ones tend to swallow up businesses, and as that sort of developed and evolved, and this goes way past the American Civil War period, and as technology, loom technology developed as well, the pipeline changed, and there would be one change in the link, and the whole thing would be influenced. But the raw products coming over from the US and the southern states, or mainly the southern states, in terms of bulk, that's what really generated the wealth. And it was sort of in contravention of this kind of notion of abolition, and which was long established. Obviously, it being enshrined in law several decades before in Britain, but it didn't really matter to an extent that abolition was in existence in this country, because slaves were being used. The actual buying and selling of slaves was fractional in comparison to the product that came from slave labor, and that's the way it was seen here. So while there couldn't be slave markets in Liverpool, and they'd sort of ceased to exist, and they'd never really been that strong, although there were slaves that did come into the city for various reasons. Later on in the 1860s, you had a situation where money was being made off the products. And again, you had this existence of a cotton exchange behind the town hall, just to kind of emphasize everything was very close. Everything was, the docks, the ships would come in. You're talking, only a few minutes walk to the cotton exchange and the town hall. The cotton exchange was a viper pit. It was an open air market. So it's where cotton was bought and sold. Basically, they didn't need to physically bring the cotton there, but it was akin to the stock market. So you imagine the kind of Wall Street, buy, sell. Well, these guys are falling over themselves to bid and outdo each other and trade in cotton from the various places that it was coming from, and it was coming from many different places in the south. So this is something that was a regular activity until the Civil War kicked in, and all of a sudden, you had a threat to it. Now, don't get me wrong, cotton was still coming into Liverpool. It was coming in from different places. It was coming in from Africa, India, and to a certain extent, it was still coming in from the US, but it had been curtailed and threatened. So this is really what caused this sort of schism, and it really brought Liverpool right into the American Civil War because of the economic link, because of the vast wealth that was being made.
Mm-hmm. And of course, during this period, we have a thing called the cotton famine, don't we, that affects a lot of the Northwest. Now, the Confederacy actually withheld cotton, don't they, from Britain, thinking that would draw us in, but they didn't realise we were sitting on a bumper crop. But then obviously we have this famine. So just explain a little bit about the Lancashire cotton famine and how this affects people. And I mean, it was quite a bad time, wasn't it?
It was grim. It was you had it wasn't just a case of threatening closures. Obviously, at the time there were no workers' rights. It was pretty much if you worked in the cotton mill, you saw yourself as being lucky. But there are certain shades of luck really when it comes to these sort of things. You were effectively from a very young age sort of indentured on it. There was no health and safety practice. So even when it was going well, even when the going was good and you had the product coming in and it was getting, manufactured and then, sprayed out to, the four corners of the earth. And I mean the four corners of the earth, there was massive demand in China for cotton. So this is where a lot of the trade and the revenue was coming back and forth from the city. That was for probably a relatively short period, but still a worrying period from the point of view of the traders. It was grinding to a halt. If you worked in these places, it was even worse because, of course, who was at the sharp end? But the workers, the working class people, they're the first ones to go, cut loose in the workhouse, and that was that because. If that's all you knew, it was very difficult if you were deemed as being unskilled to go out and find other work. And if you didn't have the income, then it was actually seen as a weakness of character back then in Victorian times. And it was a case of, right, you go into the workhouse and your existence is going to be very, very difficult. So this is that paints a picture of what was going on, and it happened for many different reasons and in many different industries in this part of the world, because it's the nature of trade, nature of business, that it ebbs and flows, and this is capitalism. This is capitalism economics. It goes, it booms, it slumps, but that slump was caused by the cotton famine at the time and the lack of supply into the mills and into the port. It was a time where they didn't have the benefit of hindsight, so they didn't know that the cotton industry would recover to the extent that it would continue to grow massively after the American Civil War. They didn't have that benefit of hindsight. After the kind of emancipation of slaves, it continued to grow, but they didn't know that was going to happen. They thought this was possibly going to be the end. There was a lot of doom and gloom projected at the time.
Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned there about the South withholding the cotton, the bumper crop I was talking about actually went, I think it went rotten or something because they had so much of it they couldn't use it quick enough, and then that has the trigger effect of then obviously the shortages come along. But again, they do start getting cotton, as you've already mentioned, from they're getting it from India and Africa and other places, and so it gets back on its feet. But also, wool is starting to be. I mean, that's already got mills for wool, haven't they? But of course, they need a lot of wool in America at the time as well for uniforms. So I'm sure that industry sort of went up a bit, did it, or did it not?
There's a balance. I mean, Leeds in particular, Yorkshire was really a kind of hub for that. So you had places like Halifax, which was, it, it was a famous centre for wool, and then of course, where's that going to come out of? It's going to be exported, manufactured and exported from Liverpool. So this is the issues with the cotton famine maybe were mitigated by other industries, and the fact that it didn't cause an overall depression. But it certainly had a very sizable impact, and I wouldn't really overplay how it was mitigated by wool or even imports from other parts of the world, because cotton prices shot up as a result, and it became very difficult for some of the mills to operate. And it took a while for it to recover. We're talking a few years before it actually properly recovered.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, let's move on to the shipyards of Liverpool, because it's famous for this, isn't it? And again, a lot of famous blockade runners will be built in Liverpool, and of course one of the most famous ones will be registered there, which I'm sure you're going to talk about in a minute. But just tell us about the shipyard industry in Liverpool at the time. How big was this?
Well, I go back to the kind of overriding theory, really, or ethos of how a place like Liverpool comes about, in that everything is within close proximity, and it makes complete sense to make the shipyards within close proximity. So now shipyards are disparate; they're all over the world. Some of them survive. There's one particular one in Liverpool that survives, or Birkenhead. But back then, it was another big industry within the city, and there were some of the best technicians, some of the best technology, particularly with the use of iron coming over from particularly places like Sheffield and being developed into steel. So steel technology had come about and was coming on leaps and bounds during the Civil War period. So you had a collection of shipbuilders. The most famous one, of course, is Campbell Laird. As I say, still in existence, still producing military fits and commercial fits to this day. But back then, Campbell Laird was certainly the biggest of them, and they sort of swallowed up other and amalgamated with other shipyards. But you did have a series of other shipyards as well running. So you had Millers at Toxteth who built what was classically happening. Just to kind of go back on it slightly, was Dunwoody Bullock was really behind this, and is sort of part of the prelude. The method the way to get around British neutrality is they couldn't build a military vessel in Liverpool, or indeed anywhere else within in Britain. That was kind of a line too far, as it were. But they had a very sort of simple workaround with it, and that workaround was to build the vessel under the guise of it being a merchant ship, but obviously with a mind to fitting it to become a military vessel, something that could ram through other hulls of Union ships, something that could take care of Union affiliated merchant shipping as well, which was a massive thing, which I'll go on to talk about. So you've got like the likes of Millers at Toxteth who built the Arito, which was registered as a British merchant ship, and very quickly became the CSS Florida. So essentially sailed out the Mersey, taken to sea, fully crewed from here, taken out to sea, and then at a convenient spot, probably an island or an enclave port or somewhere quite quiet, rendezvousing with a fitter, and then fitted up with rams and cannons and military hardware. So that was how they got round it, and it was a quite a neat trick. And for a while, it was hugely audacious. But this explains how there was this sort of this drive to build a Confederate navy in the city, and it happened hand over fist. To the extent that Thomas Haynes Dudley, this other character that I set up before, this Union consul, was challenging the courts. He was recruiting private investigators and training spies to infiltrate the shipbuilding network and be able to find evidence on that these ships were actually being built for the Confederacy. It's kind of mind blowing that these days that you would think that you could build a gunboat and then pretend it's something else, pretend it's a merchant ship. But this is actually what was happening at the time, and it was clever. It was really, from the finance to the delivery. It was a network of shipyards. Not all of them really had out and out Confederate sympathies either. In a sense, I'll go back to this thing I said before, Darren, about it's about business. It's all to do with business. It's all to do with they've got the money, so we'll build it to order. Whatever you want us to do, we'll do it. They're stymied by what they can actually build, and we'll get onto this when we talk about the laid rams. That was probably a step too far. But in terms of the requisition and in terms of the what was being demanded of this collection of shipyards, from Millers of Toxteth, Jones, Quiggin and Co., the Laird brothers that became Camel Laird. There were a long list of them. Evans and Roydens, a long list of shipyards were involved in this building the Confederate vessels. So yeah, it was a consistent business, and it was quite readily accepted. And of course, it makes sense. This is the place to go if you want to build ships. Mm-hmm. So, do it here, and you've got the money. So for many years, running from 62, 63, 64, particularly, it was sort of happening hand over fist and right under the noses of the authorities.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question as well. But I just want to say, so really and truly, it's quite sort of underhanded sort of stuff going on here, isn't there? So again, I was going to say, and ask. So the British government, what do they know about this? Because obviously, when they get approached to build a ship for the Confederacy, is that coming directly from the Confederate government, and they're asking them, and do they have like a bill of sale and a contract and all that? But are the British government kept in the dark about all of what's going on here?
It's a little bit of both, really. I mean, it's quite difficult to find evidence on this, particularly because of the way they were doing it. They were registering the ships. To all intents and purposes, they were being built as merchant ships. So no rules were being broken. It was just straightforward commerce.
They've really thought about this, haven't they, before they...
Oh, yeah. And in a sense, again,
like you said, we could potentially be in a war if we sent... And then you'll see later when we go in the podcast, we could potentially go to war with America over this, couldn't we?
It was very much in the cards. Just to go back to Thomas Haynes Dudley, the US consul, he was tight with Lincoln. Lincoln wanted them to go to either Liverpool or Japan. So he was either going to become the ambassador to Japan, a key trading power at the time, or just Liverpool, a city. So Liverpool kind of almost has a kind of city statehood. And Dudley chose to come here. He had a medical condition which was sort of connected to it, but he chose to come here. Dudley had the ear of Lincoln to the extent he was in one of the characters who was instrumental in Lincoln being elected in the first place. He held a lot of sway. So this information is getting back to Lincoln. It's getting sent back. It's getting letters were going back to the White House, and the U.S. administration were furious, and they were rattling the saber. They were threatening war over it, and to the extent that whether the British took the Admiralty or or Whitehall itself took it seriously, I'm not quite sure, because that information might be available to someone, and then if anyone does find that information, please let me know. But I am quite sure that they did drag their feet, particularly with the legal challenges. Dudley was frustrated, and especially in the early years of the war, in trying to challenge this action. Probably because it was very cleverly put together. How do you challenge something that's effectively a loophole?
Fascinating that they got away with it, really. But like you said, they wasn't doing anything wrong. So what can you do? Legally they didn't do anything wrong. So
absolutely, absolutely.
It's very, very interesting. And it would be very interesting, like you said, to find out whether there is some kind of document in the government, locked away in a vault somewhere. But yeah,
probably is. There probably is.
Yeah, I mean, it'd probably be top secret, wouldn't it?
I don't know. There's a smoking gun. I mean, again, to look at the bigger picture, because I think you've always got to do that. Britain had been all intents and purposes, yes, they'd won in the Crimea, but as we well know, the Crimea was a very nasty skirmish. It was there wasn't really much of an appetite to go back into anything. And indeed, the kind of so-called special relationship wasn't really there with the US at the time, because the US didn't have the statehood like it did later on. But it was certainly, not a thing that was to the taste of many politicians to go back to war with the US, for sure. But on the other hand, that didn't mean they wanted to let it get in the way with it of some good commerce. And so there was really kind of a sense of indifference and dragging the feet. And I know in some quarters it was slightly more than that. There was direct support for the Confederacy, and there were efforts to build upon that from the likes of Prelue and Bullock and other actors who were either based in Britain or who were travelling back and forth.
Mm-hmm. So how many of these ships were actually built and sent, and also what was the sort of cost of one of these for the Confederacy? Because it must have been expensive.
It was expensive. It's kind of, again, it's quite difficult to track. I mean, I've estimated it in the region of 70, but I could be way out there. Now, 70 is a fairly decent sized navy. Don't get me wrong. At the time, it was enough to kind of cause a legion of problems, and it's very well documented what the more sort of better known sort of Confederate ships that came out of Liverpool did. The Shenandoah I'll talk about, but this is what turned the naval battle into a world war in a sense, because the CSS Alabama, which was constructed in Camel Laird, the big, most well-known shipyard in Liverpool, still exists. The Alabama was sunk off the coast of Cherbourg, but this is not after doing an absolute ton of damage. So you've got a not just the finance, but this kind of will to build so many ships. Where the finance was coming, well, yes, it would have been coming directly from the southern states, but there's also a little bit of evidence to suggest it was actually coming directly from Liverpool as well. When you think about it, the amount of money in the city, and this problem being there, the likes of Prelue being in situ within Liverpool and being a cotton trader, so someone who was familiar with the denizens, the nouveau riche of the city, he had access to all that. And it was very easy to take money and make it look like it's clean in the books. It's sort of employing the the modus operandi of the mafia in many ways, where you've got a sort of shell company or you've got a kind of front for something, and you're channeling funds through to be able to get where you wanted. And the difficulty for me, Darren, to be honest, is to find the smoking gun, to find the evidence of all this, and I am making sort of logical conclusions here, but the money had to come from somewhere, and I'm not entirely sure it came directly from the southern states to the extent that it funded everything. I think a significant amount actually came from the city.
Yeah, wow. It is a very, very interesting topic, I must admit. And I do apologise, ladies and gentlemen, I did forget about the CSS Alabama. And I forgot that it was built, so I apologise about that. But we'll get on to this other ship that's really important and integral part of the story of the American Civil War, and that is the Shenandoah. So it's not built in Liverpool, is it? But it's registered in Liverpool. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. So the Shenandoah, iron rigged, and I'm just reading from my notes here, but it's quite detailed. But I love these descriptions. Teak planked screw steamer, right? So built in Glasgow in '63, so 1863, and captained by North Carolina, so James Woodell. Very, very strong reputation before, during, and after the Civil War as a captain of the ship. But actually crewed by Glaswegians and Irish. So you can imagine some of the the antics that they would have got up to on that.
Yeah.
Interestingly, when the ship was surrendered, and they surrendered to the British on the Mersey, which people will know about. It was the last action of the American Civil War per se. Several months after the war actually ended in the main theatre of conflict. The crew were asked by the officers the British officers that boarded where they were from, and they said in very strong Scottish and Irish accents that they were Americans. So there was an awful lot of loyalty, and I think this is something else to get across, Darren, that again, the American Civil War to a certain extent was a world war. Many of the people who were involved with it economically, militarily, came from different parts of the world. There was a lot of privateering going on, and to an extent, the Shenandoah was a privateer vessel. It was built with the express purpose, not necessarily of engaging with Union military vessels, but taking out important strategic economic interests for the Union, particularly in the Pacific and the North Pacific. That's where a lot of its action was seen. So, that is, you've got like a kind of series of vessels that are going out specifically with the purpose of disrupting Union commerce, and I suppose it was seen, by many as being fair dinkum, a fair exchange, because that's exactly what was going on with the blockade. It was like, well, tit for tat. This is what you've done to us. We're going to do it to you, and it was successful. It was very successful as a ship. It got out, and it took out in one period of time 38 Union affiliated merchant ships. A lot of them were whalers in the North Pacific. Now, you might think, well, what's whaling got to do with the American Civil War? Well, a hell of a lot, because so many of the products of whaling were either funded economically or keeping the North going and being kind of taken back into the US economy. So it was a key interest. Sorry, someone's letting the firework off around here. So
That's all right. You're fine.
So you had over 1,000 captives taken from by the Shenandoah. Famously, it went to Melbourne, and I know you've got an American Civil War in Australia listeners as well. And it went to Melbourne. It was celebrated. They had a civic reception for it. They were treated as heroes, probably because it was sort of an anti-establishment thing. Really, it was like, let's hail the rebels. There was a kind of affinity for rebellion going on. Yeah, they loved them in Melbourne. They gave them a civic reception and repaired the vessel there because it took damage to its rudder. So, in a sense, the story of the Shenandoah is a podcast or even a film or a book in
Definitely.
itself.
Yeah.
It was a Roman vessel that sort of sailed not just the high seas but the high oceans. It really took itself around. Now, people maybe look at this askance and say, well, why did it carry on in its activities after war was the war was won by the Union? Well, combinations of reasons really, but one of them was information. This is what it was commissioned to do. This was the brief that was given to the crew, and they're not really going to stop to pick this information up. So it was only gradually that they managed to get the message across that the war had ended to all intents and purposes. But of course, it was still a Confederate ship. It was still registered in Charleston as being a Confederate ship. So how were they going to surrender? How are they going to manage that? Well, what they didn't want to do was sail back to any port, north or south in the United States, because, well, an obvious reason is they were in fear of prosecution. This ship had done an awful lot of damage, as many of the kind of ironclad blockade runners built in Liverpool and other parts of Britain had done. The Shenandoah was very successful from that point of view. So they had quite a few powerful and angry people within the Union side who would have been quite happy to prosecute them, not least Waddell himself, the captain.
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted to find a safe port to go back to, and of course, one place stood out more than most, and it was Liverpool. So they took the ship back to Liverpool. Lots being made of the fact that they surrendered to the British, seen as a kind of curmudgeonly act, sort of like, we're not going to surrender, a spiteful thing or whatever. I don't think that was the case. I think it was more of a practical thing. They anchored off on the Mersey. A tugboat came out. It was boarded. It took the crew off, and including Waddell, the captain. So the ship was sort of commandeered. Ultimately went off and took another use. The famous last act, actually, of the American Civil War, it says it's on the Mersey, but the last actual act was Captain James Waddell walking up the steps of Liverpool Town Hall to sign the surrender. And
Wow.
that's how it ended. So it ended,
yeah.
And this is kind of squaring the whole thing off, Dan, and it ended right next to a place right next to where the Cotton Exchange was. So it ended where the source of so many of the issues to do with the war economically have been going on. So yeah, that's the kind of one of the mind-blowing things that happened.
It really is, because obviously, symbolically, obviously, the end of the war is Robert E. Lee and Grant in Appomattox Courthouse. And,
of course, yeah.
But,
yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is breaking news. The American Civil War finished in Britain. There you go. I'm only joking. Right. So thanks for explaining that. It's fascinating. Can I just ask quickly? So this ship was also, although it was built in Glasgow, it was brought round to Liverpool, I take it, registered, but then obviously fitted somewhere else, like the rest, I take it.
Yeah. It was taken. It was taken out again. There was a move, particularly going towards 1863 or 64. They got more audacious to the fact that to moving towards bigger boats, and perhaps this was a case of the sort of supporters of the Confederacy biting off more they can chew. They could see that they were getting away with building ships, so maybe pushing it a little bit too far. So Yeah, the Shenandoah was taken out and fitted out on a number of different occasions. I used the example of going to Melbourne, and this was what was possible. You could build a ship in one place and then fit it in another, according to how expedient it was. And this was a practice that predated the American Civil War. Sometimes for business reasons it was done, and other times it was done for strategic reasons.
Yeah. So so there's one point of the Civil War in 1863, John, where Britain and America very, very nearly come to blows. And from what I understand, the British government didn't actually really know about it straight away, and they actually put a stop to it. America sends a letter, but it's too late, isn't it? Britain's already stepped in. But tell us about the Laird Rams in '63 and what goes on there.
So you've got the equivalent of super ships, really. You've got these. This is kind of escalating. This is going a stage further. You got 1,200-ton, 230-foot vessels. So to use old money, I don't know what that is in metric, but I'm sure you can work it out. So you've got, it's a really audacious move, and Bullock is one of the actors behind this. Bullock and Prelude, they are looking to really escalate it and build it up. Probably no surprise because of the success that they've already had, and this kind of constant to and fro-ing going into the British courts and the likes of Haynes Dudley challenging them. But they, it was getting more audacious. They built. It was in line with them building a bigger consulate up in Abercrombie Square. And the plan was to build two vessels initially, sort of codenamed the 294 and 295, and sort of pull the same trick, but make them bigger and register them under a different name and then supply them to Egypt via France. So that was, again, it was sort of using the same trick, but in hindsight and looking at it now, it was a step too far, because even the British, and even with their form, the British government, the form and the British courts of dragging their feet and it being difficult for the Union to make progress, I think it had come to a point that this was too much. These vessels would have been, and no doubt had they succeeded, more would have come. Would have really threatened to tip the balance in many ways. In the absence of an out-and-out British intervention, I'm talking about the Royal Navy going in there, and that probably would have made a massive difference to the war. And there were sort of maybe machinations in that direction, but the building of a Confederate Navy in this way would have made a huge difference. It really would have threatened to tip the balance. We might be talking about only two vessels that were documented. So the vessels that eventually become the HMS Scorpion and the HMS Wyvern, known as the Laird Rams because that's where they were built. Again, the best shipyard in using the best technology in the world, crewed up with the best talent. This didn't come from nowhere. Again, you go back to the same debate: where was the money coming from? Was it all coming from the south, or was it coming from Liverpool? What I'm talking about here is a potential game changer, and the British knew it eventually because they were informed. And you're right in saying that they were slow to pick up on it, but once the sables started getting rattled, and they realised that they could have really been sure this could have been the issue that really drew them into the war. Then they started to they did intervene, and actually but Dunwoodie's sort of this scheme, this sort of organised crime style sort of front started to unravel a little bit for the likes of Dunwoodie, Bullock, and Prelude.
Okay, John, thanks for that. So, of course, you've got this amazing city, Liverpool, and I'm a Civil War buff, and I've not been there yet. I'm definitely on my way up there. You've got all these places that you can still visit today, haven't you, that are connected with the American Civil War. So, talk us through some of these amazing places.
Well, there's a plaque in Rumford Place which is dedicated to the CS Alabama. You can go and have a look at. And that's quite prominent and actually fairly controversial in some ways, because I think in recent years, and in my view, rightly so. There's been a sort of an examination of the impact of the slave trade, and I think you can't talk about the slave trade in a sense in Liverpool without talking about the American Civil War and that sort of connection. So there are plaques in and around the city, but I think what's actually probably more interesting is the places themselves. If you know what happened then, if you know the relevance, so I'm happy to sort of talk through some of them. So you've got 76 Cannon Street, Cannon Street is quite a sort of gentrified area at the time, built in Georgian times. So a big old townhouse, and it's where someone of the likes of James Dunwoody Bullock, his standing, there's the man himself, would go. You know, he came with wealth. He came from a wealthy background. Obviously, you don't get to be the future uncle of a US president without having a few quid behind you or a few dollars behind you. So that's an interesting place to go and check out. And you really get a sense of it. That part of Liverpool, actually, unlike other parts, is relatively untouched. There are less trappings of modernity around there, so you can almost close your eyes. There's a lot of film crews like to rock up there and to do the period pieces. It tends to double for London more than London does, actually. Around there. Then you've got, and I'm going to relate this one to Bullock again. You've got Smithdown Cemetery. So there's a mausoleum for James Dunwoody Bullock. What happened was, and similar reasons to what happened with the Shenandoah with Waddell, he didn't return to the US. Waddell eventually did, but Bullock, such was his activity, he probably rightly assumed that he would be in for some sort of sanction if he returned. And this is still remembering that he was from a powerful family, but I think you can see by what I've spoken about in this podcast that the lengths to which this guy went to try and win the war for the Confederacy. So he stayed in Liverpool. He had a very good reputation in the sort of civic society. He founded several causes. I think a boys' club he founded, and he sort of lived out his days in the city. So he's buried in Smith. There's a picture of his grave in Smithdown Road Cemetery, which is just on the edge of the city, kind of going through Toxteth there. Up until recently, in fact, I think it still happens regularly. I keep hearing reports of it. Someone likes to throw a Confederate saltire across his grave. So, again, just an indication of this being current and people still caring about this moment in history. Then you've got, I'm going to cross over to the Union side. Then you've got the US consul on Paradise Street.
Is this the one?
Well, actually, what I'll do is I'll talk about this one first because you've come to it. So, yeah, this is Rumford Place. So this is the site of the first Confederate consulate. Now, I must emphasize the use of the word unofficial, because the Confederacy wasn't really recognized as a state by the British. That would have been itself probably an act of war in a sense. And you have the same thing going on now. You have the same thing going on in the former Soviet Union and this kind of notion of statehood. It's a very big thing. But de facto, that's where Fraser and Trendome, which was the kind of shell company run by Charles Perillo, had its offices, and it was the de facto Confederate representation was based there. As I say, as the sort of campaign in the city developed, they moved on to Abercrombie Square. So you've got Abercrombie Square. Now, Abercrombie Square, and I'll actually be just a quick plug for a symposium that I'll be doing next year down there. That's still got a South Carolina flag kind of in the interior of that building. And they did very little at this point in 1865 when that building came about. They did very little to hide it. It was becoming more and more audacious, even though to all intents and purposes, it was a sort of closing period of the war. There was still a sort of an urge to fight on and support the Confederate effort, and it was reflected in this. The money was there to put this together. So that is Abercrombie Square, well worth a visit. It's actually part of the University of Liverpool now, so it's a fairly easy to get access to the building. And I think they do regular tours there as well, so that's an interesting spot. Okay, so this is one of the dry docks at Camel Laird. So, like I said before, and you can access some of these spots where the actual famous Laird Rams and the likes of the CSS Alabama were in dry dock. Now, dry dock itself at the time was a sort of a fairly new concept, mainly because you had the use of steel in hulls, and there was a treatment that needed to happen that the steel didn't get corroded while it was in the process of being put together as a ship. So the dry docks are still, some of them are still, you can go and view them and really get a sense of the sort of the scale. And many of these ships were sort of the most majestic ships that were sitting within Camel Laird itself. Camel Laird built all ships of all shapes and sizes, really. But these huge vessels were really they would stand out if you went there. So again, it's another place of interest. You won't see any sort of plaques to the effect of this is where the CSS Alabama or any of the other sort of ships that were commissioned. You won't see a reflection of that directly unless Camel Laird has suddenly changed what they're doing. It's not really seen as a big tourist spot, but it's there and you can go and see it. So it's an interesting place. Okay, so you've got again, let's not forget about the sizable Union interests in the city and this consulate building that was there in the same place. It didn't move. It was there from 1790 through to the Second World War, where the US consulate was based. And Liverpool, again, deemed as being a place of importance, had consulates from all over the world, including the United States. So it's on Paradise Street. There's a whopping big shopping centre right opposite, but it used to be right next to what was the customs house, a building that was ultimately was bombed in the Blitz in the Second World War. Now, again, it was all about strategy. It was all about everything having easy access, and it was no coincidence that it was right next door to the customs house and within walking distance of the docks, because they wanted to be able to have control over America, as much control as they could over American goods that were coming in and out of the city, and to be able to see with the naked eye what was happening. And this was very much the case during the American Civil War. They wanted to be able to view this activity and understand the true nature of what was coming in and out of Liverpool, because if they could tell that, then they could really get a sense of how much commerce was being funneled back to the Confederacy. So this was another part of the sort of mechanism of a sort of espionage spy thriller that was going on our streets at the time. It's now, funnily enough, a French themed restaurant, a Cote. You see these restaurants about the country. Nice steaks, I've got to say, quite nice steaks. I met my agent publisher in there for the first time to show them a real setting from my book, and this is quite an important setting in the book. You've got this is where Haynes Dudley was based. You still got the American Eagle above the entrance, although it was actually replaced. The real eagle is actually in the Museum of Liverpool, but it's an exact replica copy above the door. And the building itself has kept the integrity of what it was from Civil War times. So it's a really interesting spot, and if you know about it, then it can, and if you're aware of what was going on in that area at the time, the proximity of the docks and the proximity of the customs house, you'll realise how important this was strategically for the Americans.
Excellent. Okay, let's get on to a really important thing, and that is your book, Water Street. So let's talk about that, if you wouldn't mind. So give us an idea of, again, obviously it's about the American Civil War, people involved in the American Civil War in Liverpool, but an idea of what it's all about.
Yeah, well, Water Street is, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, it's been sort of 160 years in the making, really, and I do go back that far because my family history is, um, like many people in Liverpool, we come from different places, really. We're kind of one of the oldest melting pots in the world, and this all really, uh, transpires through what happened in the middle part of the 19th century. Um, so I grew up with stories about the Irish hunger, about my ancestors. Doing my own family research to realise that many of them lived in the courthouses. There's even a kind of African American link as well going back there. So I feel like this is very much this story and the story of the American Civil War in Liverpool and the Irish diaspora are very much linked to my being, really, Darren. So that's one thing that underpins it. Flashing forward, 2020, March 2020, we go into lockdown. All of these things happening. My background, as I say, is a screenwriter and filmmaker, so I produced films, some of them for the BBC and whatnot, and as a lecturer. It's quite difficult to make a film when you can't even get out your front door. So I returned to the idea of writing novels, which is something I did years ago. And this for me is something that I'd been meaning to get back to. I've done a lot of research in it. I developed it as a possible TV series treatment. And the best way to iterate it, and I absolutely love doing this, was to write it as a novel. So Water Street really is all of these things that were spoken about in the podcast. They're crammed into Water Street. The ethos of the time, the kind of mentality of the likes of James Dunwoody Bullock, who's sort of operating in the book, but I've changed his name. I've made him much more of a kind of direct sort of villainous character, Bannister Dunwoody, and I've the premise is that he comes to town, much in the way the real James Dunwoody Bullock does, with the brief of building ships for a Confederate Navy. But what is happening is he's come there with his new bride, his Southern Belle, beautiful bride, and her maid, who's a Creole, Haitian Creole, based in Louisiana, New Orleans. And they've come from the deep south to set up family. She's pregnant, his wife, and it's kind of transporting this southern idyll to Liverpool itself, and they quickly build a sort of reputation in the town as being part of the gentry, become readily accepted, which you would do if you had the kind of money and repute. But there's one fly in the ointment, Darren. The fly in the ointment is that his wife is a Union spy.
Oh,
She's actually
I love it.
being trained to infiltrate him, and actually their whole marriage is a complete sham. She's being set up as this woman who's from a kind of a plantation family in Baton Rouge in Louisiana, but it's all being bought up by the Union as a sort of honey trap to try and infiltrate this guy.
Wow.
Now, yeah, so this is for me. Yes, it's a plot device, of course, and yes, it's fictional, but it was a way of kind of getting across a shorthand for stuff that really happened. So all the stuff that we've spoken about in the podcast about the kind of the lengths that the Union went to subvert this sort of action by the Confederacy, and the lengths that the Confederacy went to try and build the vessels and finance and get more and more influence in a very, very rich place in the most powerful nation on earth, which was Britain at the time. It reflects that, but it also reflects, and there's an awful lot in there about the Irish diaspora and and how there was massive recruitment in Ireland, not just in Ireland but in Liverpool, for the Liverpool Irish into the ranks of the Civil War. It was a genuine option if you were Irish to go over and fight. There were Irish on the Confederacy side. So I mentioned the Shenandoah before, Irish crew on that. So it wasn't the complete blanket. You were going to go and fight for the Union. There was an option to go and fight for the Confederacy. But so many of these are reflected in Water Street. So it's sort of distilled into this spy thriller. Maybe a touch of the Western, because I'm a big fan of like Sergio Leone, and the famous thing with Sergio Leone, that's that scene where the ride in from the distance, and you got Clint Eastwood and Eli Warwick, and they're watching this cavalry come towards them, and they think it's the Confederacy, and then they dust the jackets off, and it's the blue underneath, and they end up in a prisoner of war camp. That really struck a chord to me as a kid watching that. So I've always wanted to write a story about the American Civil War, but I didn't know my entry point until I started really digging and discovering this unseen history, really, this sort of like forgotten chapter in the American Civil War, which was the link between Liverpool and the war effort on both sides.
Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating. All I'm going to say is HBO, if you're listening, contact John, please. I'd like to see this as a TV show. But yeah, anyway, anything that we might have missed that you would like to add before we wrap up here, John?
I think it's interesting. I mean, as I go along, and I mentioned this off air to you before, Darren, that there is a sequel in the offing. And the great thing is about since I published this book, it was properly published. It hasn't been self-published or anything. I have got an agent, and it's gone through a proper publishing process. So you are getting a professionally published book if you buy it. It is intended as a series, and the great thing is that through reaching out to people and reaching out to an audience, I'm getting people coming to me left, right, and centre. So I've got like a voodoo priest in Louisiana, in New Orleans. I've got a plantation down there that has its own archive that they've opened up to me called Destrehan, and they're one of their masters down there at the time was a French lineage, which was New Orleans used to be. Louisiana used to be called New France before it was bought off Napoleon, and this archive reveals how this master went to Paris and tried to get Napoleon III to get the French into the war. Again, that would have been a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
The French were a massive power at the time. The European powers were significant. So I'm sort of I'm leaning towards that a little bit with the next book, but the next book's working title is called The Agency, and it's all about, yet another link between the American Civil War and Liverpool, and it's this. Lincoln assassination, aftermath, all hell breaks loose. You've got the John Wilkes Booth famously doing the deeds in the Ford Theatre. There was a network of conspirators. Actually, that man again, James Dunwoody Bullock, linked to financing what was originally going to be a kidnap campaign, turned into an assassination campaign, and was successful in getting rid of Lincoln. One notable member of the conspiracy, a gentleman called John Surratt, escaped. He managed to get out through Canada, and he eventually escaped. And have a guess where he landed up?
Liverpool.
He ended up in Liverpool.
Yeah.
So it's a direct continuation, really, of Water Street. That's going to be my next book, and it involves the detective agency, which is the kind of forerunner of the CIA and FBI, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which were Lincoln's bodyguards. Yep. Ultimately didn't do a good job, although this agency was fundamental, really, to the whole notion of the Secret Service in the United States. So again, it's got a very strong historical link and that's the pitch for the next book, which is developing all the time. I'm bringing in all sorts of characters, and maybe a little bit more about the kind of the land issues in the in the American Civil War. I will be bringing it into that story.
Awesome. Oh, I look forward to that. Well, all that's left to say, John, is thank you very much.
Warmly appreciated, Darren. Really appreciate you you having me on, and thanks to everyone for listening as well.
Cheers, everyone.